for them to invade than it would have been in 1950, because the state of our technology has advanced, the state of our ability to get off the Earth has advanced, and the destructive capability of our weapons has advanced, if you can say that that is an advancement. But so it looks to me more like it's scientific interest, and I would think that if the situation was reversed, meaning that we had found an industrial society on another world that was about to move into the space age, we would take a profound interest in them. And we would probably visit that world a little bit more often than we might visit other worlds, just to watch their progress and see how their society evolves. So I would speculate that their interest would be scientific. Their interest is somewhat benign as opposed to benevolent, because they're certainly doing nothing for us, but they're not doing anything to really harm us either. So it's more benign than anything else. That would be my guess.
Okay, and would you say that this then incorporates the abduction phenomena, or do you think that that's something completely different going on?
I believe that the solution of the abduction phenomena is terrestrially based, meaning that if there are any abductions, they're very, very few and far between, and that what we're looking at as the abduction phenomenon, which doesn't make me very popular in the UFO field, but what we're looking at in the abduction phenomena is probably a number of different terrestrially based problems, that there is no single solution to it. There's multiple solutions, but everybody is looking for a single one that covers all the facts, and I don't think that's going to happen. So the abduction phenomenon, if you take the abduction phenomenon and accept it as based in reality, then it's certainly not benign, and in fact is somewhat harmful. I don't believe it's malevolent, but it would be somewhat harmful. But that's if you accept it as being I guess conducted by alien creatures, and then it at least in the United States, it boils down to which researchers' information do you accept. You accept Bud Hopkins, who has the cold calculating scientific entities doing their experiments, or the David Jacobs theory that they're actually attempting to interbreed with the human race and create a hybrid race that can inhabit our planet,
right?
Or the John Mack philosophy, where they sort of had an Eastern philosophy of sort of nonviolent Eastern philosophy. So it all kind of related to, in the United States, which researcher had been conducting the research and what information he, and in some cases she had gathered.
Yeah, and is there any one of these that you favor? I mean, we had David Jacobs on the program, and we talked about his research, and that was horrifying to say the least in that sense. And what's your take on his research? If that is true, that's a horrific picture a reality that he paints there.
I think I would throw in with the Bud Hopkins that David Jacobs has taken it a little bit too far. One of the things that we noticed, and John Mack had pointed this out originally, that it was interesting that the abductee experience sort of mirrored the belief structure of the researcher. In other words, those who believed in the cold calculating scientists always seemed to end up with Bud Hopkins, and those who believed in the hybrid system always seemed to end up with David Jacobs, and those who believed in the Eastern philosophy always seemed to end up with John Mack. And Mack said in his book that he and or Mack, not Mack's book, but C.D. Bryant's book on the MIT abduction. I think it's on page 273 of the hardback edition. Mack was discussing this and how they had kicked this around, and I kind of reversed that and said, could it be that the researcher is subtly implanting his or her belief structures on the abductee and getting to that point? And if you look at some of what Jacobs has done, he talks in the thread about a woman who came to him and believed that she had sort of a guardian angel, and the guardian angels were these alien creatures who were interacting with her in the abduction phenomenon. And after he had conducted some 30 or 40 hypnosis sessions with her, hypnotic regressions with her, she came around to believe that they weren't all that friendly and they weren't all that nice, and it became frightening. And I'm thinking, this is very illustrative of the problems with hypnotic regression and that sort of thing. But we have a subtle implantation of ideas by the researchers. I don't think they're consciously doing anything, but they're looking for specific things. And if you look at the transcripts as they have published them, you can see the subtle implantation of the ideas, where they say you put somebody in hypnotic regression and they say, well, I don't really remember anything. It's, well, yes, you can, and we'll go a little deeper and we'll look a little harder. And do you remember something like this, or did something like this happen? And eventually you get to the point where that individual is relating to the researcher what he or she wants to hear. And you have to look at all this stuff very carefully. Hypnosis is not a good way of doing it. So the abduction phenomena is badly flawed because of that. And Russ Estes, Bill Cohn, Dr. Cohn, who is our clinical psychologist, and I did a book called The Abduction Enigma 12 years ago, and we suggested ways of improving the research so we could answer some of these questions. But today the research seems to be conducted in the same ways. We haven't changed anything, and we haven't advanced anywhere.
Well, that's an interesting point, absolutely, and it seems to me as well then that the phenomena overall seems to be more of a relationship with the human being, the belief of the human beings who are studying it as well then, and depending on your perspective as you outlined, it will take a different shape. So it seems to be very difficult to come to some kind of, if you will, objective truth, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, exactly. The problem is, there's a number of problems, actually. One of the problems is the egos of the researchers, so that their belief structure gets in the way of accepting information and evidence. And I'm as guilty of that as anybody, although I try to overlook it. And one of the best examples is the idea of a crash on the plains of San Augustine. And Stan Friedman and I had a number of discussions, or little skirmishes about this. And one of the points that he made, in what he called was a false claim by me, that I said there had been archaeologists on the plains of San Augustine in July of 1947 who would have seen the crash over on the plains had it happened. And he said none of them were there at the time. Well, we found documentation that put one of the guys there on the 1st of July in the Bat Cave, which is on the eastern side of the plains of San Augustine. And I sent this information to Stan, and he wrote back, well, we don't know how deep in the cave they were, and we don't know which way the cave faces, and we don't know all this stuff. And it wasn't, oh my gosh, there was somebody there, what did he tell us? It was, here's the reasons he couldn't have seen anything. And if you're looking at human habitation in a cave, you're not going very deep into it, because the human habitation is usually in the very entrance of the cave, where they can see out. They'll get light from the daylight, from the sun. But the other thing was the evidence in this report that came out from Harvard University, I believe, in a letter the guy wrote in December of 1947, said that they had camped 150 yards from the entrance to the cave, and they had a panoramic view of the plains all the way from the south to the north to Daddle. So they had a panoramic view of the plains the whole time they were there. And yet Stan's response was, this is interesting, what does it tell us? His response was, well, they might not have seen anything because of this, this, and this. Well, all of those questions have been answered, and had something fallen on the plains of San Augustine in early July of 1947, these guys should have seen it. And they did not. So we have a problem with the idea that the Roswell crash was two things colliding, one falling near Corona and one falling on the plains of San Augustine. But the ego, Stan's ego in this case, was such that he was looking for excuses not to accept the information, rather than looking at all the information and saying, this is very good. I'm as guilty of that as he is. I mean, I can say, well, when people came to me and told me why Frank Kaufman shouldn't be believed, I was looking for reasons to believe Frank Kaufman, rather than looking at the evidence that suggested maybe Frank Kaufman wasn't telling us the truth. And we eventually learned through a preponderance of evidence, it was undeniable that Frank Kaufman was not telling us the truth.